Initially I wanted to make this as a first impressions, but I decided to play further. The first two bosses of the game felt like a very long tutorial phase, and I wanted to really experience the game before giving my thoughts on it. It is quite a long game, but that's on par of the course for an RPG game, as they tend to be on the longer side anyway. If we only look at the first part of the game till the first boss, it feels quite lackluster, and my thoughts would have reflected that, but going further the game improves drastically. That doesn't excuse the fact that you need to go through several hours of gameplay before the game really feels like it gets going. But anyway, Paper Mario Origami King. I bought it partly on a whim and because I liked what I saw in the new combat sequence, and it was going back to being a turn-based game, or sort of, as I would find out later. Now I'll be honest, the last Paper Mario game I played was Paper Mario. Yeah, the one for the Nintendo 64. That said, I am aware that Thousand Year Door used lots of the same systems and mechanics, and I know I'd probably love playing that too. In fact, technically speaking, I did play it for about an hour at a friend's house, but that's besides the point. What I'm trying to say is that I know that they changed a lot up since then, and I've only really paid attention to Thousand Year Door, and I know a little bit about the Super Paper Mario game for the Wii, so my impressions will keep in mind that these are the only 3 games I really know about in the Paper Mario series. Let's start with the obvious, the graphics. The game is gorgeous. It is a stylized art of Paper Mario cleaned up and just vibrant. It's very crisp and smooth. And I'm not sure if that makes sense, but it's like if Apple made the MacBook but made it as a video game. Now as great as it is, there is a bit that I feel is lacking. There's no more exclamation points to denote something interesting. In the game you just get the clean plain text like press A to open. It would have been nice to have these small symbols or hieroglyphs used, as I think that went back to the original art direction of Paper Mario. But maybe when Nintendo decided that it makes sense for the game to not include these things, because the game would look less clean otherwise. It almost feels too pure, too formal with no room to play around. It's paper, it doesn't need to be so perfect. Even the wrinkled paper feels exact. Everything artistically is done with intent and it shows, but it almost feels over-polished to me. Mario practically looks like a shiny sticker than an old paper that's been around for a while. In fact, most of the characters look like stickers and plastic rather than paper. It's great, but too sanitized for my liking. Certain movements look odd too. The characters can be 3D sometimes while still being in their usual 2D cells, and it was displayed in the very first scene with Luigi driving a car, and his arms were bent in a different plane from the rest of his body. Mario can use the hammer looking forward or backwards now, while in the older games the hammer could only be used going left or right. In this iteration, it makes sense that he could use the hammer in any direction, but it doesn't make it look any less odd. Next of course is sound. The music so far has been bangers. Combat music reminds me of music used in Pokemon combat, so there's no complaints there in that department. There's the typical dark music and silence playing for caves and dungeons, and the lighthearted tunes for when strolling through some grassy meadows. The sound effects are largely familiar, so take that as you will. Moving on, I do like how easy it is to tell if a character is an enemy or a friend. Friends are paper, Origami are enemy. Even if the characters are normally enemies like Shy Guys or Goombas, it manages to eliminate any confusion that could have happened, and makes it part of the story too, with Origami characters all part of the Folded Soldiers army. Now for the gimmicks introduced in the game. Confetti is a fun little mechanic that I feel kind of meh on really. It looks cool and it's a celebration of color, but it's also sort of a nuisance making you repair holes in the world to proceed. Later on you can buy an accessory that changes the confetti to be cherry blossom petals, which is pretty neat. I don't think it really adds too much to the game, it's kind of just there. But oh yes, is it pretty. The other big mechanic is the 1000-fold arms. This I'm more okay with. It adds a neat way to interact with the world by banging, pulling, and tearing things in the world that would otherwise be out of reach. It's a bit annoying to work with motion controls because, in my opinion, the motion controls on the Switch don't feel quite as well tracked as they did on the Wii, but it provides an option to turn off the motion controls. That said, for most of the game I've decided to keep it on, and I like how it's being used in different ways, unlike confetti, which has only been used to fill holes in the world. Giant papier-mâché enemies are also something that you have to fight in the regular world. They don't cause you to go into a combat encounter like the other enemies, but honestly they're kind of boring and a chore to clean up. Cool idea, but annoying to have to deal with. Whack them 3 times with a hammer after knocking the sticker off their back, and it explodes into confetti and coins like any other enemy. A minor change that improves the game is that instead of having a heart block to heal you, there are benches. Save blocks and heart blocks are important to the design of Paper Mario, but transferring the power of the heart block to the bench Makes it fit in with the aesthetic of the game and the rest of the world a bit better. Small change, but I think it's a good one. Although there are still hearts lying around that you can pick up occasionally, the game only really throws these at you if you've been damaged, but I still like this better than the heart blocks of old. Of course we need to talk about the combat. I like it with one small caveat. This is a turn-based combat system, but for some reason there's a timer. If it were a multiplayer game I probably wouldn't mind, but in a single player game it feels a bit out of place. I get that it adds challenge, but it wasn't exactly what I expected. And of course this is ultimately a kid's game, so none of the combat is actually particularly challenging, but is more engaging than combat in Pokemon games or other JRPGs. If you're particularly careless you can still die of course, and game over, but it's not difficult, and once you go through the tutorial of the combat the system isn't overly complex. The controls are a bit wonky to get used to, but as Todd Howard would have put it just works. When fighting minions you stand in the center and spin the enemies around you into favorable positions. When it's a boss battle though, the boss is in the middle and you spin arrows around to lead you close enough to the boss to attack, and other icons are thrown into the mix to collect on your walkover, such as 1+ action, double attack power, chests, and coins. While not what I expected, it is executed well, and is not punishing if you screw up. Oh, and one big complaint I have is the text scroll speed. It is so painfully slow, and I couldn't find anything in the settings to speed it up. In an RPG game, there's bound to be a lot of dialogue, and this game has a lot of it, so sitting through the scroll speed with no way to change it makes it that much more awful to not have an option to speed it up. I know this is nitpicking, but small things like this can ruin an otherwise good experience. Also, it gets a bit anime feeling sometimes, which is odd. I don't find it either positive or negative, just something I observed. It's not a big deal, but it's something for you to consider. Lastly, we have to talk about the elephant in the room, and by elephant I mean Toad. The Toad in the room. Toads are no longer just generic filler good guy NPC characters, no. They are objects to be found, freed, flattened back into paper form, and essentially collected. I'm rolling in the toads. So many toads. Must save the toads. Toads are a currency in the museum to unlock collectibles, so keep that in mind. And I think that's about it. I haven't finished playing it, but after 4 bosses and around 5 hours of gameplay, I feel like I have enough of an impression to say what the game is like. I give this game 8 toads out of 10. The other 2 are hiding somewhere probably, and need to be whacked with a hammer. It's toads of fun. It is a polished game and it feels good, but it has room to be better. It's far from perfect with a tutorial that takes too long and initially gave me a fairly mediocre impression of the game. It only starts to pick up after the second boss in my opinion, and the dialogue is great and funny at times breaking the fourth wall, but the scroll speed is really slow. I still like it a lot and I'm not upset with the purchase at all, just that my vision of Paper Mario game is different from what Nintendo put out. Outside of the combat system, the game plays it fairly safe I think. The characters are mostly generic, and outside of the Origami girl and her brother, all the characters are familiar. That said, there are a lot of characters in the Mario universe for the game to use, and yet it decides to use toads for too much in my opinion. Initially I had written down as notes that it's not a bad game, but leaves me wanting, and largely this is because of the older games in the series being so good that in comparison this feels like it needs something more to complete the experience and round it out. But after playing it further, past the first boss, the game did finally pick up and become a lot more of what I was expecting. If you've never played a Paper Mario game, or even if you have, this is a good addition to any game library. Thanks for watching.